one thing, what do you think, I mean, given that this comes out of the companion and that avoidance or lack of inclusion of women poets, what do you think the significance of this edition is and will be moving forward? Because I mean, it's a big statement, and it's a very important statement.
Well, so when that happened in 2018, so one response to that was a movement which you may remember called Fired, which was a group of women poets who came together. People like Christine Murray, Mary O'Donnell, and Cathy Darcy were kind of leading that. And we put together a pledge as part of that group. And did loads of other things as well, like there was a series of events, kind of hedge schools with people getting together and teaching each other and reading poetry to each other by women poets. So a kind of self-education. But for that pledge, which was a kind of, it was a pledge where people who were involved in the poetry scene in Ireland or the literary scene could sort of sign up to say, that they would ask questions about gender parity, so that if, as editors or as organisers or whatever it might be, that they would ask, just ask if it was happening, and that they wouldn't take part in events or publications that didn't involve gender parity. And there was a kind of preamble to that pledge, which I remember asked, you know, when we have these publications that you know, marginalize women and kind of recreate this sense that there were no women poets before the 1960s or whatever, you know, what message are we sending to young and emerging scholars and poets? Are we telling them that their contribution is going to be deemed less valuable? So for me, I think this book is kind of a letter to those young and emerging scholars and poets. Say, well, no, right? We're going to be reading you. We're going to engage with you. So I think that's kind of the first significance of the book is to reach those emerging poets and scholars. I think the other significance of the book is Anne Fogarty has a wonderful introductory essay for the book, where she talks about how all the kind of feminist tactics that we see in Irish poetry today, so things like women running publishing presses, mentorship, patronage, self-promotion and so on, all those kinds of tactics, we've seen them before, right? They're not new. Women throughout history have been doing these things. So one thing we learned by looking at the history of Irish women's poetry is that those things are not enough, that they have to be answered by readers. Readers have to engage with the poetry and interpret the poetry and become intimate with the poetry. So this book is, well, doing that, each chapter is, you know, providing an intimacy with the poetry. And I think that's kind of the significance, that it will allow readers to have that intimacy and it will allow that engagement with the poetry.
Ailbhe has mentioned the excellent chapter towards the beginning of the book by Anne Fogarty about anthologies. But something I found very revealing about that chapter was the way in which it rendered very problematic the idea of a progressive and evolutionary chart journeying towards inclusiveness, because if anything, I mean, the anthologies from the period maybe the 60s to the 80s were some of the least inclusive of the century. If you take mid-century anthologies, and they were still kind of maybe dutifully including revivalist women poets who then just fell away completely, and to the nadir of Kinsla's Oxford book, which, I mean, literally includes no women at all. The only one is Evelyn Dovney-Cuddle, who is in his translation. So I think that meant that for somebody of my vintage, I was receiving a very skewed sense of literary history, even quite recent literary history. But I think that the paradigm then that was very much in place when I was a young man was one of a kind of hand-washing passivity, so that the editors challenged on this and would say, well, I'm not seeing this work coming in to the letterbox. And there the argument rests, as though you can't just go and, you know, make things happen, just shake things up, have a special issue of your magazine, do whatever it takes, rather than just present yourself as being at the mercy of these somehow unchangeable forces, because it just wasn't true, nor was it an accurate reflection of Irish literary history.
just moving away just from that for a moment, indeed, I'm just wondering about the state of Irish poetry and about anxieties and influences. I mean, are there any great towering figures? Who are the great towering figures that people are afraid of as they sit down to write poetry nowadays? I'm thinking about anxieties of influence. I'm thinking about Heaney worrying at one stage, suppose, are being accused of writing as if Yeats were always looking over his shoulder. And I think he says that he'd like to think that all poets should write as if Yeats were looking over their shoulder. Who looks over Irish poets' shoulders these days, one wonders, in making you tremble or perhaps encouraging you?
Good grief. I mean, thinking about women's poetry, thinking about writing poetry as a woman, I think Eva Boland has become that kind of
course.
In both ways, that she's a towering, terrifying figure, but also someone who's there at the desk,
right.
You know, who thinks of the rooms of other women's poets and is a companion. So yeah, for me, that would be the answer.
Sure.
Well, there's been a kind of a terrible harvest of senior Irish poets dying off of late, people in their 70s or 80s. And you begin to wonder that, I mean, do people who are maybe only 10 or 15 years older than you are, do they have to become one's, you know, feared elders? Or are they the kind of Easter Island statues in the landscape these days? Until eventually there's nobody left who's older than you, and you have to internalize all this for yourself.
That's really great.
And then just one question. Obviously, working as the editors on this collection, was there anything particular that struck you or surprised you as you worked through the different essays and the different materials?
Well, I was just going to add another thing, really, which is the creative practices in the oral tradition were another chapter that really kind of blew my mind. Trina Ní has written a chapter for us about that. And like, obviously I knew kind of vaguely about the oral tradition and how it worked, but I mean, she just really evokes it so amazingly, the kind of total immersion in the oral tradition, and then this practice of composing in performance, and just how really extraordinary that is, and how alien to anything we do now. And there's just, you know, there's kind of anecdotes in that chapter, like she talks about Bess Cronin, the sean-nós singer, as a child waking up in the morning and hearing women singing downstairs and coming down, and there's a kind of a kitchen full of women and they're all churning butter and cooking and sewing and singing this song, and she asks them to teach her the song, and they say, well, yeah, we will, of course, because, you know, before breakfast is the best time to learn something. So her evocation of this world was just just really stunning for me.